Extras. If you paid careful attention, you might get the impression that the skeletal monk, Mahar, had no real impact on the battle at all. He didn't inflict a point of damage, and the only attacks that hit him were area attacks which also targeted player characters. Here's the thing. The fight was actually broken up over 2 sessions, since we didn't have time to finish it the first evening. During the week in between, I realized that when setting up and fighting the first part of the battle, I had forgotten to put Mahar on the initiative list. He got left out entirely. But he was there. Obviously, he should have been fighting alongside them. So when we resumed, I retconned that he had tried to help, but had been taken down by an accumulation of fireballs and Morduval's whirlwind attacks. It would have been a lot more useful if he had been running around taking down minions, but we'd all forgotten, and it was a bit late to change that much. However, when I explained the retcon to them, before they knew what the result would be, I acted out that scene where Morduval used his evil Command Undead ability, and Mahar resisted it, giving Zahir's henchmen at least a moral victory of sorts. Of course, since he had no effect on the fight, it wasn't hard to slip that same retroactive continuity into the video, because Mahar's actions didn't influence what the players did at all, but I also wasn't going to kill him off in such a lame way, in a battle he basically didn't take part in. So, the tentacle casters, who again, don't even have a consistent name in my notes. They're fairly mysterious abominations. Little ones guess that they were all an extension of Morduval's own tentacle form was interesting, and kind of logical, like most of his guesses, but was not actually the case. Under those robes, they appear to be nothing but a large tentacle, branching into a pair of tentacle arms. The robes Draven collected afterwards for research were not magical, but they had definitely absorbed traces of both the strange magic that created these creatures and the acid mist they dissolved into. They have a creepy Earthglide form of movement, and a fair amount of eldritch spellcasting power, but their general low intelligence, their obedience to commands, combined with their acidic self-destruct on death, all hinted at them having been bred or engineered to serve. Almost all of them were minions, the type who die in a single blow. As with all minions in our game, they have evasion and metal to help simulate the 4th ed version, so that they almost always have to get hit or fail a save in order to be killed. But this is the first time I employed caster minions against the party. My concept of caster minions is that they would generally have a single, simple attack spell at will, and possibly some utility spell, either a weak at will one or a moderately effective once per day. In any case, you want to keep their bookkeeping to a minimum. For example, a 4th level party might encounter a mixed group of enemies with a CR3 monster, 3 challenge rating 2 melee minions, and 3 CR3 caster minions, each of whom uses a caster level 1 attack spell each turn. So they might magic missile for 1d4 plus 1 automatic damage every round, or maybe one of them runs up into certain death trying to Burning Hands several PCs at once for 1d6 save for half. On one hand, spells tend to be far more powerful than basic weapon attacks, but on the other hand, low-level caster minions will have a garbagey armor class, and they really fill the usual role, superior numbers of fragile attackers who should be killed ASAP to avoid taking a lot of unnecessary damage. Now, given the party was level 11-ish, these weren't piddly single magic missile casters. You normally don't see a gang of enemies who can fireball at will. They did so only with a caster level of 6, and 6d6 save for half, with a poor save DC, isn't as bad as you expect when you hear at-will fireballs. But obviously, this continuous area damage becomes incredibly dangerous as you stack them. Normally, I would not have put in so many with that spell. It's more balanced to give them a variety of different spells which don't stack as brutally. But when planning the encounter, I basically knew that most of the party would have strong fire resist still active, so I knew that they would be both very scary and impressive, and yet fairly ineffective unless Morduval got some people dispelled. And he wasn't likely to use the Ray version much, because his whirlwind and other attacks are so much more efficient. His ability to project that ranged dispel was really just about his only defense against flying heroes. Anyway, the one non-minion among the tentacles, the wizard, was clearly more intelligent, whereas the minion ones were sorcerers, fireballing based on their charisma. But it's hard for an enemy to act more intelligent than the GM, and I spent way too many of his spells on defensive buffs. Somehow, I had put together his memorizations and never looked at the list to say, wait, he only has 4 things to do in the fight? Or maybe I just assumed he would be prioritized and killed so that his chances of living long enough to cast 5 spells were very limited. But as it turned out, the party basically never attacked him, meaning the buffs which made up more than half of his castings had no effect whatsoever. I'm sure the tentacle guys could make some kind of unarmed attack if they had to, but I hadn't even bothered to put one in their stat block, so it didn't make a lot of sense for an intelligent wizard to walk up and slap a dangerous hand-to-hand combatant for 1d4 plus 1 or whatever. So when he ran away near the end of the battle, it wasn't so much me making it easier as poor planning on my part. But without that poor planning to balance out the other poor planning of having 6 at-will fireballs per round, it probably would have been a party wipe, so I guess it worked out. Clearly, this was a difficult fight, and it was supposed to be, though a couple of things pushed it almost over the edge. There were several key elements to the difficulty. One was, of course, the fact that I used 6 fireball minions instead of the 3 I would have used if the party wasn't expected to be crazy fire resistant. Our party has very little area of effect damage, basically just Draven's weak fireball wand, which would be fine for clearing minions except that it has poor save DC and minions only die if they fail their save. Plus, the fact that these were fireball casting monsters made the players suspect they'd have natural fire resistance. Actually, they didn't. They had acid immunity instead. But it was a perfectly reasonable assumption. The problem is that party's fire resistance turned out to be a double-edged sword, because the chain fireballs were horribly bad for black, having been dispelled by the goo, and yet the perceived immunity of everyone else caused them to basically ignore the caster minions, who came back to bite them later. Another factor was Morduval's insane defensive stats. This was a reasonably well-planned feature of the encounter. Conceptually, Morduval's runes would render him virtually invincible, which would obviously be unfair. But this allowed the Rahjs to show up, and by simply neutralizing that advantage, she could turn the fight from unfair back to fair, effectively. While, from a meta point of view, it hints that Lady Hazemura wielded powerful magic, yet without outshining the party at all, since they are still doing all the work. From the perspective of battle difficulty, though, it worked out to be a lot nastier than just revenue neutral, because she didn't show up immediately, and even when she arrived, it took a full round cast for her channeling to take effect, and in that time, the party wasted a whole bunch of precious actions attacking Mord and finding out just how powerful the Eldritch runes were. And those runes were no joke. They granted plus 10 armor class, plus 10 to any pre-existing DR. In Morduval's case, he had DR 5/silver, which this boosted to an almost Pit Fiend quality damage reduction of 15/silver, as well as 20 resistance to all damaging energy types, including force, sonic, and, in the case of an undead recipient, positive energy. And it even gave spell resistance of 20 or plus 5 spell resistance, whichever is greater. Hell, the party didn't even notice the spell resist, because about the only spell anyone used on the old man was Orb of Force, which ignores SR. Other than the runes, Morduval's actual stats, HP to hit, etc., were actually pretty similar to the undead tank. 2 attacks at plus 20 for 3d6 plus 11 damage. While the tank had a couple basic Crusader maneuvers, Mord instead had a Whirlwind attack, which had 15-foot reach instead of his normal 10, and made a single Dispel Magic check against each target hit. He actually also had improved grab, getting free grapple on any target hit by both of his slams, who he could then constrict for 2d6 plus 11 with his tentacles. But as far as I can remember, as far as I can see in my notes, it never actually happened, and he spent most of the fight with enough enemies in range that it always made more sense to whirlwind them with his Wrecking Ball eye. Which was fine, though not constricting anyone sadly took away a little from his feeling of tentacleness. Originally, I was going to have separate stats for him with and without the transformation, but I quickly realized that it made more sense to only have one set of stats. It works the same way as if he transformed as a free action at the start and just stayed that way. But I like the very different and imposing feel you get from a guy whose transformation is almost like a contingency. It's so fast you can't catch him without it, but he always turns back in between. The video was a pain in the ass, even with the large amount of reused footage. But I do like that it was mostly captured the dynamic I imagined. This little, usually naked man, totally unimpressed and unintimidated by the powerful heroes. And when you swing a sword at him, the instant before it hits, this mass of hardened tentacles burst out, stopping the attack dead. I think of it as an unusual form of magic where maintaining the tentacle form costs a great deal of energy, but the actual transformation back and forth costs relatively little, so that changing back is almost always more efficient than staying big. But back to the question of difficulty. With the runes, Morduval was damn near immune to almost all of the party's attacks, and between the natural cycle of trying different attack types, on the reasonable assumption that he had to have some weakness, and the solid fog, which slowed the party's progress substantially at the start of the fight, such that it took almost all their actions to probe his defenses, they didn't feel like they had any extra actions to whittle down the apparently harmless minions. This, combined with the time delay before Lady Hazemura's arrival and the subsequent suppression of the runes, meant the enemy force had longer than I had really imagined to wear down the PCs with their unrelenting attacks. In overall balanced terms, the runes were supposed to be neutralized by the Rahjs to a very small net effect in the bad guy's favor, but in practice, they worked out to more like 2 free turns of actions for the villains, which in a close fight could easily have been decisive. So, Lady Hazemura of the Rahjs appeared when things were most dire. Did she save the party? Well, in a way, but I think it's more accurate to say that she made it possible for the party to save themselves. Her arrival raises a lot of questions, though. Why was she there at all? What was really going on? How did she know to arrive at that place and time? For that last question, let's just say the Rahj's divination powers are not to be underestimated. They are divining, studying, and attempting to predict more things than would be possible for most beings under ordinary D&D rules. They are particularly focused on trying to infer the well-hidden actions of their mysterious enemies, a process I imagine a little like the way astronomers search for exoplanets, which cannot be seen directly, by measuring the wobbles of adjacent visible objects. However, it seems that since Lord Kintomazu's previous encounter with the party, they had also constructed a fate matrix for our heroes. Not that anyone really knows what that means, but it certainly appears that they are attempting to build a powerful multivariate map of the key events of their likely futures, like some kind of divination-based computer modeling. There's only so much that you or the party can know or infer about the Rahjs at this point. Clearly, Morduval was aligned with forces which are considered enemies by the Rahjs. But we know how calculating and cold these unusual Rakshasas are. Lord Kintomazu was dragged into a bad bargain by that Nyogi, forced to assist in making possible experiments which he considered repugnant, down in the ancient Adar chambers, and he shed no tears when the party killed the little insect. But it doesn't seem that he thought of the Nyogi as an enemy. The Rahjs simply decided they should not deal with Nyogi in the future, and moved on. The party tried as hard as they could to kill Kintomazu, and he still held back and tried to deal with them until the last possible moment. And after the party ransomed him back, the Rahjs didn't just keep their end of the bargain, but now one of them shows up and helps our heroes. What does it take, then, to become their enemies? Well, they didn't ask, so you don't find out. At the moment. But if you were trying to guess what was so important to bring Hazemura to this battle, there appear to be 2 main possibilities. Either the Rahjs consider the party to be a valuable resource worth saving, worth this level of personal risk, which may be possible if their divinations give them as powerful a view of future possibilities as their dialogue implies. Or perhaps Lady Hazemura came because, with the party there, it was an opportunity to stop Morduval and his patrons from gaining the Collana Dialia. We know the Rahjs don't really want the chaotic artifact for themselves. We know this because she said so, very clearly. And though the PCs have no proof of this, it seemed pretty clear to them that these particular unusual Rahjs are the sort of beings who do not lie. Or at least, they do not make false statements. It does seem likely, though, that if the party hadn't been there, she would not have tried to stop Morduval alone. The fact was, Lord Kinnokoro was away on other business and not close enough to intercede. One-on-one, without his minions and without the ancient glowing runes, Hazemura may well have been able to beat Mord. But with the runes, she, like the party, had almost no ability to harm him. And that's the point. Those runes ensure that a single Rahj can't defeat this Lieutenant of Swain. Aware of this, the Rahjs had devised their counter-magic, but it required two of them working together, one to suppress the runes, the other to fight. With only one Rahj close enough to the scene, the technique was worthless without somebody else who could deal the damage. This implies that Lord Kinnokoro is powerful enough to do what almost killed the party here, though, to be fair, he would have started with detailed knowledge of his opponents, whereas the PCs were badly hampered by their lack of information in this fight. Anyhow, all this doesn't answer one pertinent question from the comments. Would Lady Hazemura have saved the heroes had Angel failed to finish Morduval in the end? And that's a tricky one as a GM. I may have miscalculated a few things about the fight, but this was not like the Warforged Daggerface incident where I totally blew it. It was very hard, but the party certainly had a chance. Nobody was absent, and so if they wiped, it would have been a wipe. But Lady Hazemura was still standing right there. Could she finish Morduval? No. Or rather, the odds were very poor, even damaged as he was, since the instant she cancelled her channeling to take real action, his runes would spring back into existence, likely saving him. I think the most logical action she could take, meaning almost certainly what she would do, would be to acknowledge defeat, break her channeling, stride over to the nearest of the unconscious party members, and dimension door away with them. Which means she would have saved Angel, and the others would have died and had to re-roll new characters, while Angel's player would have had a choice whether to NPCify her character and restart alongside them, or to try and continue the group with Angel as the anchor. On a last note, if anyone is wondering, why would Swain or Morduval take this powerful artifact and test it out on some random spirit in the Feywild? Well, I can think of some good reasons. But all that presupposes that Mord was telling the truth when he claimed he needed it back. He may have been outright lying, or it may be a bit of a gray area. I'm hoping to find time for a Tumblr post in the near future with some behind-the-scenes info on designing Morduval's look for the video. If you don't want to miss that, and other funny or interesting junk I post from time to time, make sure to follow me on demonac.tumblr.com or on Twitter at TalesDDC. If you've listened this far and want to support my channel directly, you can chip in at patreon.com/Demonac. Every contribution is appreciated, but if you donate even $1 per month, you can download an MP3 of the Vampire King theme, the main music from the battle with Morduval, as a little thank you. And don't forget to like these videos.